It is great to have you guys all here. My name is Jason Romano. I'm the host of the Sports Spectrum podcast, and joining us today is Gary Haugen, who is the CEO and founder of the International Justice Mission. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you.
Of course, Adam LaRoche, 12 years in the big leagues, former Gold Glover, and you saw his story earlier. For those that are here in the audience in San Antonio, welcome, Adam, to the podcast. Appreciate you being here. Let's start right with Gary and what IJM, International Justice Mission, is. Tell us about it and why you started it 20 years ago.
So International Justice Mission was formed in order to protect the poor from violence. 20 years ago, I was working as a prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice, and I was, in 1994, sent to Rwanda to be the director of the UN's genocide investigation. And in the midst of that sort of horrible experience, one of the things that became clear to me is that in Christian ministry, and I had grown up in a Christian family, and my wife and I had been very engaged in supporting overseas mission work, we found that Christians were very much engaged in meeting all kinds of needs amongst the poor, when poor are hungry or if they're suffering from disease or lack of shelter. But the huge gap that we found was that there was no one to respond when the common poor were suffering from violent abuse and oppression. And one of the largest categories of this violence that preys upon the poor in our era, it's hard to imagine, but it's slavery. And so IJM has been working for 20 years now, providing direct service to victims of violent abuse and oppression in very poor communities to rescue them out of those circumstances of abuse, but then also make sure that the bad guys are brought to justice, and then to work over the long haul for the healing of the survivors of that abuse. And now we're starting to see these communities empowered to transform their whole justice system so that it can actually provide protection. So it was a simple mission, started 20 years ago, and God has blessed it. The heart of justice that is in the heart of God and meant to be poured out through his people is just profound, and that's what we're seeking to live out every day.
It seems to me when you're starting sort of a foundation, just the idea of getting that started is so overwhelming. Like to even just take that first step. What was that moment like for you, just to do that?
For sure. I mean, I think that's probably the hardest thing to do in regard to any of the big problems in the world. It's getting started. But I think Jesus gave us the clue to that, which was just love your neighbor. Like he always cares about the one. And so I can remember our very first cases that we did, and we didn't do very many in the first year or the first two, but it was rescuing that one child out of a brothel. It was rescuing that one family held as slaves in a brick factory. And out of that, I think we found the principle that as you are faithful with the little thing that God gives you, you don't actually have to be the one to somehow make it big or large. You don't have to bear that burden. He will, as you pursue health, he produces growth. And that's what I think we've seen over the years.
That's great. Adam, for you, something happened that broke your heart for you to feel a passion to want to be a part of this, to want to get into this world of human trafficking and help make a dent in it. What was it that broke your heart?
Yeah, I grew up, I was not a great kid. I wasn't even a good kid, as a lot of you can attest to, for sure, my wife. But I always had a heart for the people that were defenseless or getting taken advantage of. And I'm so thankful for that now, because fast forward to 4 or 5 years ago, whenever it was when I got introduced to the word trafficking and this slavery issue. Because before that, this was never something I wanted to get involved with. This was never a mission of mine in any stretch at all. And I think God kept pouring different people and different organizations into our life. And I'm speaking for Blaine and I. Blaine's been my partner in this fight. And Blaine, as a matter of fact, introduced me to a guy that was working in Thailand at the time with the Exodus Road, and that was kind of my first introduction to trafficking and what it meant. And over the course of about a year, and just hearing story after story of the things they had seen and gone through. We finally went over there, and actually Mickey Weston went with us, and just got a brief glimpse of how awful and disgusting that underworld of evil is that goes on, and not just in Thailand, but in all corners of the world. And I couldn't turn away from it. It was, and obviously you saw up here, it made the decision to leave the game that much easier, knowing that this was something God wanted me in. And I'll give you a quick example. Before we went over there, my biggest fear, being a man, was that I was going to go into these brothels and be looking at half-naked women and get off mission and lose my train of thought or my whole purpose of being there. And so my prayer for a couple months leading up to this was just give me the eyes of Jesus. That's all I want, is to go in there and have Jesus' eyes. And I'm telling you, it still chokes me up just thinking about it. But that was the greatest answer to prayer I'd ever had, because when we left any of these brothels, I couldn't have told you. I can't remember anything except from the neck up. I remember tons of faces. So that was just one more of those little gifts from God saying, this is something I want. This is a fight I want you involved with. And we came back, and now we're trying to figure out what we can do moving forward.
It's one thing about wanting to be involved and help. It's a whole other thing when you are going in and doing what you just described, Adam. I just want to ask you, especially for the audience here, but for our listeners, what is that conversation like with your wife? And having to have that conversation, not just to walk away from baseball, that's obviously a gigantic decision that is a whole nother type of conversation, but getting involved in this, what was that like?
I mean, we could call her up here and let her explain.
Well,
Difficult for a while, and to be honest, I probably screwed up early on, and probably didn't include her as much as I should have. In that, in this whole discussion of what we were getting into, I will say, and it's such an awesome relationship. I'm so lucky. I think over time and talking about it, I think she realizes that it is something that we've been called to do. To some extent, I still don't know exactly what that is, but I think she saw that it was a passion of mine, and like she always does, backs me on it. So, but yeah, I try to put myself in her shoes and realize how difficult that would be to have your spouse go do that, and she's been awesome with it.
That's great. Gary, I was going on your website, and I saw a number that just completely blew my mind. It said 40 million slaves today are still out there. 40 million. That number just punched me in the face. It blew my mind. How is that even possible that is happening today?
Yeah, I think this is the one thing that people just don't realize, is that there are actually more people in slavery today than in any other time in human history. There are more people in slavery today than were extracted from Africa during 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. More than 40 million. What does that look like? Well, it's people held by the millions as slaves in brick factories, in rice mills, rock quarries, where they sit, and I've seen them by the thousands, just hammering little rocks with a hammer. And then you've got millions who are also taken into the ugliest kind of work you can imagine, which is what Adam saw, which is forced prostitution. UNICEF tells us that there's more than 2 million children held in forced prostitution. So this is just the business of rape for profit. And the reason it exists, Jason, is really quite simple, is that there are some places in the world where they just don't enforce the laws against this. The victims of it are very, very poor. They're very marginalized. You would know that there's 2 billion people on our globe who live off less than $2 a day. And in that desperation, there's people that tell them some story about, come with us and we'll get you a job over in this city. Come with us and we'll get you a place to go to school. And so these kids or these families will be uprooted from their communities, and then these criminals will traffic them into places of violent abuse where they are forced to labor under the threat of violence. The good news is that this is actually a very stoppable thing because it is against the law now everywhere in the world. We just need to bring effective law enforcement to these places. And what we've seen now, Jason, is that in a very short period of time, you can see slavery just collapse when you have actual enforcement of the law. And we've been starting to see this now over 2 decades, and we can start to see how this is actually the first human generation that may see the end of slavery in human history. Because think about how ancient slavery is. I mean, if you think about the Exodus story, that's thousands of years old. This could be the generation that sees the end to that. And we're just praying that God would use us to be part of it.
We're going to talk about a trip that Adam made in a minute, but for you, can you give us an example of going in and sort of walk us through how you find where they are, what's happening, and getting them out? Can you walk us through that process?
Sure. So it does take proactive undercover investigation. So years ago, for instance, in Cambodia, I was part of an undercover investigation where you simply go, as Adam was describing, sort of posing as an interested customer, particularly for child prostitution. And in some of these cities around the world, you don't have to walk far before a taxi driver will be saying, young girl, young girl. Yeah. So if you indicate some interest in that. So I was taken to a suburb outside the big city of Phnom Penh, and I was taken into a brothel, posing as a customer, and then I'm taken into a back room where I'm presented with a dozen kids between the ages of 5 and 10 years of age who are just being sold to what they think is a foreign pedophile or sex tourist. So this is the proactive undercover investigation that you do. Then you take that information and then you work with local law enforcement to conduct a raid operation to rescue those kids out, arrest the criminals that are there. Then we put those survivors, those children, into long-term residential aftercare. Many times it takes years and years and years to bring them to healing. And then we work, our lawyers work for the conviction of those criminals. And then over time, we retrain the whole law enforcement system in that community so they effectively actually enforce the laws. And where we've seen that, as I mentioned, we now have outside experts measure that sex trafficking of kids collapses by 76%, 86%, 85%. So it takes all this difficult entry into the dark places where horrible things are happening, but we still have a God of justice who's on the side of bringing rescue and restoration, and that's what we actually get to be a part of.
It's really great. Adam, we've heard a little bit about your story already and why you wanted to get off the couch. You didn't just want to write a check from afar or kind of put a social media post or a Twitter post. You wanted to get involved. You went on a trip recently to the Dominican Republic with IJM. Tell us about that experience and what you learned.
Yeah, and kind of what that came from is when we got back from this first trip 3 years ago, I can't remember what year it was, but it really wrecked us to the point where we traveled around and met with as many different groups as we could on this topic and really just to learn for ourselves. I mean, it was the most confusing 10 days over there trying to wrap your mind around a topic that not too many days prior to that we really had nothing. We couldn't have told you anything about it. So not only was it confusing, but then God's involved and the Holy Spirit just crushing us the whole time we're over there. So we come back and you saw some of this, but we just went on a quest to learn as much as we could about this fight. And naturally, IJM was one of the stops. They were gracious enough to let us in there and kind of let us pick the brain of quite a few of Gary's employees. And it wasn't long after that I got to go down with Dee Dee Pujols, Albert's wife, who's just an awesome woman and does a ton in this whole trafficking slavery fight. But we went down and met with Gary's team in the Dominican and got to spend a few days and just get a little taste of what was going on down there, but also really got kind of updated on the global stuff they were doing. At the time, I didn't realize that you had as many, I guess, field offices and employees all over the place. So another eye-opener to go down there and get to spend time with their team there. I look forward. We were just talking about it earlier. I look forward to going back and hopefully taking some of these guys with us.
Gary, we hear international justice mission, so we think overseas, we think these different countries. What about in the United States? Is it prominent here? Is it still happening right in our own backyards?
Yeah, every country has the problem of human trafficking and slavery. It's sort of like the AIDS epidemic. You'll remember everywhere around the world we found that HIV/AIDS was a problem and it was spreading, and every country had to address it in their own community. But we also, when we saw the epidemic from a global perspective, you could see that actually 70% of the HIV transmissions were taking place in a handful of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's a similar thing here. There are indeed thousands of victims of trafficking in the United States. But if you solved all the trafficking problems in the United States and all of the European Union, you'd still be left with 99% of the problem in the world. And so we have to address it in our own communities, need to raise awareness, but what we have is excellent law enforcement that can address it in our own communities if the local citizens and the churches and the people of goodwill raise their voice to make it a priority. But around the world, in the poorest communities, they have such broken law enforcement that the enslavers and traffickers can run free. And that's where we have a substantial challenge because children are really in grave danger in those settings.
Yeah, I just want to add to that on the question of it happening here in the States. And it's great recently because it's becoming more and more of a topic. So I think people are becoming more aware of not only what's going on in some of these third world countries, but that it is going on in our own backyard. And that was one thing when we came back and got to meet with the IJMs and 4 or 5 other organizations. When we started hearing about the issue in every county in the States, and over the last couple of years getting to work, do some work around this in the United States has been about as shocking as any of it. That's so good to hear that there could be an end in sight, because sometimes it feels like this is a problem. And I want to say, is this one of the fastest growing criminal crimes, I guess, one of the fastest growing crimes in the States or globally, or I mean, it's taken off. So thank God for some awesome organizations that are knocking it down.
Adam, we're doing this as a live podcast in front of a live audience. There's baseball players here, there's their wives. You're finished with this interview and a baseball player comes up to you and says, I want to help, but there's something that just, I don't know, maybe it's fear, something that's keeping me back. I want to help. What are you saying to that guy or girl that comes up to you?
Yeah, and I do want to say, and I think Gary would agree that this isn't for everybody. I don't know. I'm not saying that God is putting this on everybody's hearts. There's some huge issues out there. We've heard about a bunch of them. PAOs over the years, whether it's the water mission, poverty, education, you name it. This was just something that would not leave over the course of a year.
Yeah.
To where I've really felt obligated, and I'm so glad I did. But I would just say to dig into it. I feel like an infant when we start talking about this issue. I don't even feel qualified to talk about the issue of slavery, because every time I get to sit down with Gary or anybody who's been around this, I learn things and hear things that not only did I not think were possible, but I had never heard before. So I would love to talk to anybody about it at any time, but I would say just dig into it. And if you continue to feel that tug, and you guys know what I'm talking about, you get that feeling that that you can't really get out of your mind, I would say that's the Lord, saying to take the next step.
Gary?
I think so much of it was what Adam said at the beginning about that prayer where you asked for Jesus to give me your eyes. And I think for any one of us, if we just really very sincerely ask Jesus, hey, what do you want to show me? What do you want me to see the way you see it? And I think that will just lead you in compassion to some place where just your heart beats fast, you can't put it out of your mind, and it will not be something you have to go engage or do. You will just feel like, this is the joy of God being released in me to go have this purposeful fight to engage. So whatever that is, I just think it will come as you're in conversation with your Maker about how he's shaping your vision and shaping your heart.
Adam, this is a question we ask a lot of our guests on our podcasts, our regular podcasts that we do. But I'll specifically ask you in terms of this issue, this cause, this passion of yours. What have you been learning from the Lord in your time in seeing what you've seen, what you've gone through in trying to help out with this cause? What have you learning from God?
Well, again, going back to kind of what I was saying earlier about having a heart for people that just can't defend themselves.
Yeah.
And I see in so many areas in the Bible where he's calling us to go defend the weak and the fatherless and the oppressed. And for a long time, I would kind of skim through that and I guess think maybe that didn't apply to me, or that wasn't something that was right in front of me that I could reach out and see, and I just never really pursued that. Although again, I think from a young kid that was somewhat ingrained in me. But that's a great question. I'm learning patience. I'm learning to love regardless of race, religion. Don't get me wrong, I'm still working on all of this.
Of course.
But I've seen him work in some ways in some really dark areas that it's been neat to be a part of. So
It's really good. Gary, let's close with this. And I saw that Albert Pujols recently helped put together a strikeout slavery night at his ballpark. And so obviously Adam here is helping bring awareness with some of the great things he's doing and some of the great things that he said. For those listening to the podcast, for those watching here in San Antonio, for those listening from wherever they're listening, it could be months from now, years from now, from this time. Athletes have large platforms. Others have very, very small platforms, or what they would consider no platform at all. How can people get involved? How can the people here, how can others, what can they do, big or small, to get involved?
Yeah, that's the exciting thing about this for me, is that there are ways for everybody to make a difference. And it's inspiring to look back at history, actually, the way Christians led the fight against slavery in the 19th century and in the early 18th century in Britain. William Wilberforce and the great abolitionist leaders here in the United States, they generated a movement of the people of God. And everybody played a role in that. The first thing was just by awareness, to making people aware of the problem. You know how they did this 200 years ago, 150 years ago? They circulated that picture of that slave ship stuffed with all those bodies in it. That is the thing that circulated by the millions that made everybody aware, oh my goodness, I've heard this thing called slavery, but now I've seen it. It's little things like that that we do to share with one another in our own circle of influence. Again, if it's huge, great. If it's our own a smaller circle, about, do you know that there's more people in slavery today than any other time in human history? That would be a new fact. Yeah. So whatever our sphere of influence is, raise awareness, then raise our voices, because it is significantly the job of the authorities around the world to get after this problem and to enforce the laws, and they respond to what the people care about. And then thirdly, honestly, is just to help provide the resources to bring the rescue the poor cannot afford. And I just know there are people who take enormous joy, even though they're not the ones who can go themselves to rescue those kids out, they can actually send the people to do it. And so there are ways for all of us to get into this fight so that when our grandkids ask us about it, Grandma, Grandpa, like, where were you when there were 40 million people in slavery? We can say that we showed up and did our part.
So far, IJM has rescued more than 40,000 people from violence and oppression. And today, IJM is helping to protect 21 million people globally from violence. There's a long way to go, but IJM is making a huge impact around the world, literally saving lives. Gary Haugen, CEO, founder of IJM, Adam LaRoche, 12 years in the majors, Gold Glover. We appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much for being here on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks,
you.
Jason.
Thanks.